my name is Lady Elizabeth Roy. I'm a psychology major studying the erasure of humanity, how the American penal system is ruining our society. My thesis argument is that through the continual perpetuation of unjust penal practices and justification of a carceral state, American society has been pushing for an even greater disregard for incarcerated people. So why should we even care? Well, both of these statistics have shown, whether in 2024 or 2021, how terrible and how high the American incarceration rate are per 100,000 individuals. Amongst all countries, America is ranked number 6 in high incarceration rates, with majority of the top 6 being authoritarian nations. And then compared to NATO nations, so those that are Western more so free state nations, America has a high disparity rate in incarceration in comparison. Even the most liberal state, California, couldn't compare to the United Kingdom, which only has 129 per 100,000 population being incarcerated. Additionally, the penal system affects more than those who are currently sitting in jail. It's affected those who have formerly been incarcerated, those who have ever been convicted of a felony, anyone who has a criminal record, and on top of that, the family members of those who have been in prison or jail for at least even a day. And then on top of that, we should look at the people who are currently being locked up. What does that breakdown look like? And of the millions of people who are incarcerated, 550,000 of those are sitting in local jails. Jails are a holding period. This is where individuals go when they are facing their time in court or when they've been arrested for a crime, not where they go for sentencing. That is prison. That is once you have been officially convicted of a crime, then you'll be waiting in prison or being held in prison. However, with the local jails, 448,000 of those individuals are not convicted of a crime. That means 448,000 individuals are technically innocent until guilty. So why do we have such a high incarceration rate of individuals who are innocent? Why do we have a high incarceration rate of individuals who need greater stability and help rather than just being in jail? Well, we can look at the history of the penal system. Originally, there was the idea that once a criminal, always a criminal. This is seen with the slave patrol era when individuals, especially those that were enslaved, were after being convicted of a crime, they were being beaten, harshly tortured, or to the extent of death. The US was heavily inspired by the UK's penal system. As you can see in the bottom left corner, there's an image of a man being executed because he couldn't pay his debt off. And during that time, it was because once a debtor, always a debtor. It's the idea of you would never be able to amount to much nor be able to pay back what you owe. So you should just deserve death. That mindset has then translated into America. That is why we had jails. It was a holding period until proper punishment can be inflicted. It wasn't until the late 1700s, early 1800s that we grew into a penal system with a prison. And in this, the Quakers actually created the first prison. It was the Walnut Street prison. And this idea was that redemptive suffering and one's soul can be saved, right? But only through pain and torture. So if you see in the image in the middle, there's a man, and this happened a lot, unfortunately, who was getting a cold shower or bath. And this idea is that he's basically being drowned. A whole tub of very cold, harsh water was being poured on top of his head. And a lot of times it causes like lightheadedness, feelings of being drowned, and a lot of mental discomfort and anguish. And from there, we can then see that prisons are inhumane. I found that early prisons, their cell was a 3x3. Nowadays, it's like a 12x6, 12x3, depending on the prison. It's still very small, very confined. It restricts people, which I get it. It's supposed to be incarceration, but it also restricts some of their humanity. That right to just be able to walk around, that's removed because you are now an animal. You are someone that's to be caged, right? And from there, we have convict leasing. That's that idea that your body is no longer yours. It's forced to be worked for either um, private corporations or for the government. And then this idea, a lot of times people were abused, beaten severely, malnourished, and a lot of death occurred. Unfortunately, during the convict leasing period, a lot of people couldn't survive for the 10-year sentence. They died beforehand because the conditions were too harsh, too terrible. And is reported a lot. And even so now, it's very unsanitary on the prisons that we do have. During COVID, it was a lot of people who were receiving, a lot of incarcerated individuals receiving COVID. However, they never stepped out. It's because it's a hotbed for a lot of diseases and hostility. A lot of deaths occur in prison. A lot of mental anguish and torture still go on, especially through the use of solitary confinement. which has led me to find that the penal system is actually ineffective. And that's because 1 in 5 incarcerated people are locked up for a drug offense. So putting people in prison for substance abuse is just a band-aid on a bigger problem. And prisons are not the place to go because they don't truly reform individuals. And then once people are released, they have a hard time getting a job. This is shown on the data on the right, which shows it was actually worse than the Great Depression. It's very hard for individuals to get a job because when they're asked about their criminal background, they should be truthful. They generally are required to. And in doing so, a lot of jobs don't want to hire them. Beyond that, having prisons aren't actually effective at deterring anyone from committing criminal activity. So even though we have longer sentencings, more prisons built, crime rates have not decreased drastically because it's not a great deterrent at all. So now that means that we need to look at a better way to change our society to not want to commit crimes. What should we be doing instead? And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier, solitary confinement is still something that's used today. It just shows how ineffective they are because in 1899, we learned that solitary confinement is not an effective tool. It's actually harmful for the psyche. It causes a lot of mental suffering, even to the point of individuals wanting to commit suicide. Right. But it's a tactic that's still used today up to 24 hours. And it just goes to show that these are not rehabilitative nor restorative measures, but instead they're practices used to just house individuals, inflicting continual torture and pain. So, in conclusion, prisons have failed to live up to their proclaimed message of saving the soul and have instead warped it into a game of who can endure the most pain and who can inflict the most damage. And this is evident through the non-rehabilitative nature and ineffective practices fostering more hostility. As seen on the image on the right with Khalif Browder, he was a young individual, a teenager who spent 3 years in Rikers, a jail. He was arrested and the charges were later dismissed after 3 years. However, during those 3 years spent in Rikers, he was in solitary confinement for over 400 days. It caused a lot of mental anguish and torture where he attempted suicide multiple times. He was also severely beaten by fellow guards and inmates during his time. Once he was released, he had a hard time being reintegrated into society. It was just super hard for him. He couldn't understand that connection to people because he spent a lot of time alone in isolation, and he was mentally exhausted, going through a lot of turmoil. But he unfortunately committed suicide, and that just goes to show he's not the first nor the last person to endure this because the prison system, the penal system, is ineffective at properly preparing people for society afterwards. It's not a rehabilitative nor restorative measure. The penal system is very corrupt, and unfortunately, it provides more harm than any good. Here are my resources, and I would like to say thank you for sitting and watching my video. I hope you've learned something new.